If all 44 presidents fought each other one-on-one, who would win? Hosted by two history professors who have too much time on their hands, Scott Rank and James Early. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Southeast Regional of Presidential Fight Club. We are starting off with, I can't really call it a bang. It's a Clash of the Titans, but James, what's the opposite of a Clash of the Titans where you have a clash of the, I don't know.
Clash of the pygmies.
Clash of the pygmies.
Clash of the wimps.
Whatever sort of invertebrate sea animal that doesn't have a spine that exists as long as nothing else touches it or attacks it. That's what we have for round one, because we have Woodrow Wilson versus James Buchanan, which is sort of like a polar opposite of a Teddy Roosevelt versus George Washington. And we're going to find out very soon why that is. So James, tell us about the incredible, indomitable power of Woodrow Wilson, the man.
Let me see what I can do to make a case for him. So Woodrow Wilson was born of a minister, a Presbyterian minister, and he was a lifelong Presbyterian, very devoutly religious man. He was not a big fighter. He wasn't much into physical fitness. He was plagued by a variety of health problems all of his life. He had really poor vision. He was nearly blind in one eye. He had a lifelong history of diarrhea and other intestinal issues, and so he is not going to be the toughest fighter in the world. But let me see. How about this? He was a very bookish man. We all know that. He's the only president we've ever had with a PhD. PhD in history, I might add. And also he taught history, he taught political science. But he liked sports. He didn't play sports, but he studied them. He studied baseball. He studied football. He started teams. He coached sometimes. He actually coached football at one of the colleges he was at before he taught at Princeton. So perhaps in all of his studies, he would have picked up a few moves, or picked up a few tackling techniques or other techniques, how to headbutt somebody. So he was, forgot to mention his physical dimensions. He was 5'10", so not a terribly short guy. 170, was very, very thin his entire life. So didn't have a lot going for him in the physical department, but he's going to make up by studying. You know, some of the greatest soldiers in our history learned their soldiering from books, not just one book, of course, but you think about Henry Knox, Nathaniel Greene in the Revolutionary War, who had no military experience and yet became great generals. So that's what I feel like Wilson's going to do this time. I think he's going to learn from his football studies how to take down James Buchanan.
Fair enough. Nathan Bedford Forrest was also lacking in any military experience and was great as a cavalryman. And like Woodrow Wilson,
he was a bee.
Like Woodrow Wilson, a big supporter of the Ku Klux Klan also. Yeah. Well, I have James Buchanan, and I'll say this. Woodrow Wilson is weak by nature. James Buchanan is weak by nurture. He was a very squeamish man. Most historians would rank him as one of the worst, if not the worst presidents in American history. He did nothing to avert the Civil War. He supported the Dred Scott case that African Americans could not become U.S. citizens. He ran out of the White House fleeing after the 1860 election. Now, in terms of his physical abilities, he is a big guy. He was a little over 6 feet tall, and he had broad shoulders. But this is where, that's about all I can say positively. He's described as having small feet for his size and took quick steps. His most distinctive feature, as one biographer described it, was a wry neck, where his head was habitually cocked to the left. This wasn't a muscular malfunction. Instead, it was an eye disorder. One eye was nearsighted and the other was farsighted. So the way you would compensate was always cocking his head and closing one eye as if you were talking to someone or sizing them up, looking at them skunk-eyed, as if you were looking off into the distance. One of Buchanan's eyelids was always twitching, which combined with his personality led to one biographer describing him as a fidgety little busybody. He was also, like a lot of other presidents, a huge fan of drinking. He would always visit the Jacob Bayer Distillery in Washington and pick a pick up a 10-gallon cask of old JB whiskey, and when guests of the White House would notice that the initials were the same as his own, they would assume that he had his own distillery since he drank enough to be able to cover for one. So drinking constantly, big guy, fidgety, poor eyesight, but with how weak Wilson is, and if you push Wilson hard enough, he might have a stroke on the spot, that's where I see Buchanan winning this round. Well, James, what are the results of this first fight?
The result of this fight is that for the reasons you mentioned, James Buchanan triumphs. I think all that drinking helps makes him impervious to pain too. So if Wilson ever manages to land a tackle or a punch or a headbutt that he learned from his books, I think Buchanan is not even going to feel it. I think he has a slight size advantage too, and so I think that's why he gets the nod.
And Wilson, that's the classic academic. I have no experience in fighting, but I've studied it, so that counts. It's really the same thing. And there's been an opening up of his archives to the point that historians are starting to notice, like a William Hazelgrove book, Madam President, that Wilson had a stroke in 1919, and his wife, for all intents and purposes, was basically president for the last, year and a half? Is that right?
Yes.
Right. So
she controlled what he got to see and what he didn't see, and sometimes she would just make decisions on his behalf when he was completely incapacitated. He kind of went back and forth between being barely able to do things to not able to do things at all, and some of his closest advisors also participated in the scam, if you will, or the conspiracy.
Okay, well, that's Woodrow Wilson. Didn't get very far. Really, by dumb luck, James Buchanan advances. And in the second fight of round one, we're going to see Andrew Johnson go up against James Madison. Thanks for listening to Presidential Fight Club. If you'd like to download your own printable bracket sheets for each regional tournament so you can guess how the tournament will go, check out presidentialfightclub.com. We'd appreciate it if you could rate and review us on Apple Podcasts as well. Thanks for listening, and may you fight with the stamina of Teddy Roosevelt, the courage of George Washington, and the reach of Abraham Lincoln.